Last week, I introduced the topic of Dwapara Yuga, not so much to go into the mechanics of Sri Yukteswar's exposition in the Holy Science on what he meant by it. I mean, what the mechanics of it are, because you can read the Holy Science, the introduction there to find that for yourself. And that information is available other places. But the thought is, what does it mean when we use this term Dwapara consciousness, and the word that enters into some of our discourses? We just throw that word about, and sometimes a person who's not familiar with the thinking in terms of the yugas might wonder, what in the world is that person talking about? And so I thought last week to just introduce that topic of Dwapara Yuga, Dwapara thinking, Dwapara consciousness, and give a little background on that. And then this week, what I would like to do is follow up on that and discuss some of the implications of that, or maybe some of the trends that we might anticipate as we go forward. When we look at this world, we see that things are changing. And for some people, and perhaps many people, there's a thought of, well, it's a random change. It's circumstantial. There's no particularly pattern to it. But on the other hand, if a person understands what Swami Sri Yukteswar was saying, he was saying that there is a directionality to world events, or the larger macro universe in terms of direction of consciousness, expanding consciousness, because we're in an ascending age, and that slowly, because of various cosmological principles, that the Earth itself, is our solar system, is being bathed by greater waves of energy, and that those waves of energy are slowly uplifting the general consciousness of the planet. Whether as an individual our consciousness is changing or not by our own efforts, there is an environmental effect that rises and falls, and we happen to be in one of those cycles. Just like I was reading in the news the other day that we're entering into a new sunspot cycle that every 11 to 22 years, I guess, returns back to sunspot activity. In a sense, expand that by multiple digits behind it, and we find ourselves in a ascending yuga. What Swami Sri Yukteswar said is a Dwapara Yuga, which will last 2,000 or so more years. Now, that sounds like a long time, but it depends how you look at it. It's not very long at all. When you look at the geological history of this planet and its evolutionary history, it's not actually that long. But for us as individuals, it's a significant amount of time. And so we must remember that we are only in the very beginning of this phase. And these phases transition, because then there's other yugas, ascending yugas, that follow us. And that Dwapara Yuga is said to not actually be that much of an enlightened time. It's a restless time. As I expected, or as I explained last week, it's a time of restlessness. But it is higher than the age we've come out, this dark age of Kali, which awareness is much more limited. And the characteristic trait of Kali is that we feel, and our perception is limited, and the general mass of humanity perceives that this world is essentially matter. It's at the essential basis of our reality, is the essential substance of this universe is matter. And it's from matter, you could say, we express it in terms of our consciousness as matter is the reality, and matter has created this consciousness. Consciousness comes from matter. It's just simply electrons in the brain, or neurons and electrical currents that give rise to consciousness. And this is a limited, untrue perception of reality. It's, as Yukteswar said, it's a darkened way of looking at things, because there's a much broader perspective that can be use to perceive what's going on, and that matter is not the ultimate reality, it's consciousness, and that and we're coming to that understanding. And in this age of Dwapara, over the next couple thousand years, Sri Yukteswar predicted that mankind will come to understand and begin to realize subtle forces, subtle electrical energies and attributes will be discovered that people will begin to realize, and both outwardly in the macro universe outside of ourselves, but also subtle energies within ourselves. And this is the basic principles upon which yoga is based upon, is inner energies, but then also outward, but science itself will come to discover these outward energies. And one of those first of those outward energies that was discovered at the beginning of this transitional point from Kali Yuga into Dwapara Yuga was electricity. It was not something before a couple of centuries ago. It was something that people were very dimly aware of. Lightning, perhaps, static electricity, perhaps, but mankind, science began to harness that. Now we take it for granted. But I once asked Swami Kriyananda, what is electricity? We were having a discussion on that, and he said that it was his feeling. He says, he asked back, that sort of threw the question back at me, is electricity part of this physical world of matter? He says, I think of it as an astral energy, and Master characterized electricity, which we use, as the animal current of the astral world. And who knows what in the future might be potentials for us. And so today I thought we would look at a little bit about some of the characteristics of Dwapara Yuga and maybe contrast them to the Yuga that we came out of, this Kali Yuga consciousness. And one of the things that I emphasized, the effect of these yugas have upon the individual and our individual state of consciousness, because isn't that really what our interest is? We're very self-centered, and what does that have to do with me? And in Kali Yuga, the individual was interested and was forced, because of physical circumstances, to adapt to his circumstances rather than rising above them. And so we found mankind was forced to find ways to adapt to that. And it was a time of outward form, a certain rigidity of consciousness, rules and regulations, institutions shaped one's life and thought of everybody. And in society, to disagree with those, put oneself outside the governmental order, you might say, of the king or whatever institution was dominant in those times, or in religious organization. But Dwapara Yuga is time more of the individual. Individual begins to experience much more greater freedom in a time of expanding energy, greater energy, and people begin to realize that they have some control over their individual circumstances. And essentially, this sounds very good, and we can see that in the world at large today, the role of the individual is being emphasized. And that also, as I mentioned last week, is mankind begins to think in terms, and not just conforming to circumstances, but their self-interest. It's a time of self-interest, which is a time is expressed also by the word ego. Ego. It's an egoic age. I think of what's in it for me. And that you could say that's the negative way of looking at it spiritually, but it's a reality. A person begins to awaken to, I can choose, I can make choices in life. What is in my self-interest? And I want to be happy. I want a better world for myself. And perhaps I don't want to think about the hereafter. What's in it right now for right now? And the individual actively begins to not just conform to circumstances, but to alter those circumstances. And the individual begins to feel a sense of self-empowerment. Here we have much more greater energy at our control, how can I use these forces now to better myself, empower myself? But of course, that can be used intelligently, wisely, or those forces can be used for selfishness, for greed, and for making wrong choices. So like I say, Dwapara Yuga is arrested. We have energy, but we don't necessarily use it wisely. And so the first tendency is for us to use that energy or to use our interest in improving this world for our own individual self. We can affect the world around us to better circumstances. We have a great deal of expansion, of being able to expand our skills, our knowledge, and we have a certain sense of autonomy vis-a-vis institutions, vis-a-vis religions. We're not forced as much, but it doesn't necessarily mean we'll use our powers of individuality, our powers for self-interest for the right reason, for the right highest reason. And one of the things that, and what I'm saying is based upon what Sri Yukteswar said very pithily, and then expanded upon somewhat by Paramhansa Yogananda, and then Swami Kriyananda expanded on this topic too. And some of this is my own individual perspective on this, but is that this age, 2,000 years, we're at the beginning part where self-interest is very motivating, but self-interest, because it's egoic and selfishness, that can be a time also of conflict. And you have time of disruption that can happen. Eventually, of course, the trend of Dwapara Yuga would be self-interest eventually coming to enlightened self-interest. If we look at that Adam Smith, that philosopher, English philosopher, who basically is said to be the father of capitalism, he said, each person working for their own self-interest makes the best economic market, and prosperity is a result of that. And we've seen that capitalism has brought great prosperity, and probably in the years to come, much more prosperity will come. And it's predicted, of course, that the world at large will become much more materially prosperous. And Swami Kriyananda was once asked, because he had been in India for a number of years in the 1950s, early 1960s, and then he was back in America, and then he came back to India in 2003 and was there until his passing much of the time. And he was asked, Swamiji, you saw India 40 years ago or 50 years ago. Have you seen changes spiritually in India since those days? And Swami said, there were many more high spiritual souls I met in India in that time. First time I was there in late 50s and 60s, I met many saints at those times, and I don't see that quality of people in India now. And he said, but that's how it has to be. He says, because India is going through and must go through a period of modernization, and material wealth must be dispersed. Whereas he says in the 50s, the material level of the general population was not as high, and that could not be sustained for the long term. He says, so in this age, that the general population, their material basis must be satisfied, because until that is satisfied, the world or society at large is not going to be as prosperous. And so it's a phase through which India, he said, must go through. But he says that spirit of those great saints remains, and it will take a little time, but then the general population as a whole will evolve. And so this, you might say, the trend of much of the world is the world has to come out of the dark age of poverty into being uplifted into some level of material prosperity before society as a whole can begin to think of more eternal verities as a whole. But it's important to understand that every age has great souls in it. And of course, you have people who are basically in a higher age in Satya Yuga consciousness. But of course, every age also has people who are mentally dull. And because you can't have all or nothing, all of it, there's always going to be a spectrum. But age is defined when the mass of, to what degree of level of consciousness, the mass of consciousness. And this is how Swami Kriyananda described it. When the majority, general consciousness is of a certain level, then you can define that age to be in such and such a yuga. And I'll come back to that, of how he described Dwapara Yuga a little bit later. But basically, it's the age of the individual. And it's also an age of reason. It's a Kali Yuga, you could say, was described by commandments and unquestioning acceptance of this is what you have to do. You could see in India, the caste system, very structured. What you were born into is where you would end up. But that began to change. And you can see that's no longer applicable so much today. And so consequently, it's an age of the individual. It's an age of rationality and logic that we've entered into. It's an age of energy and energy awareness. It's active, where you could say Paul Kali Yuga was a little bit more passive. It manifests in certain ways. One of the things that I've noticed, and I think you can look about, in this age, there's been in only a couple hundred years ago, worldwide, that the vast majority of the population were engaged in subsistence agriculture. Now, there's still many people in countries, India, for example, and the people are still subsistence agriculture. But I know, for example, in America, 150 years ago, 70% of the population of America was subsistence agriculture, the small farms and agricultures. But a great change with the Industrial Revolution and the 19th to the 20th century, the transition, they began to leave. And now 80%, probably, I think it's about that, 80% of the population of the USA lives in urban areas. And I think you're seeing this trend around the world. Cities began to grow. And one of the bases of cities, of course, is energy, and of course, the efficiency of food production, that energy is applied to these different areas of life. Commerce, self-interest, individuals beginning businesses, going into business or industry. Much of it is motivated, as Adam Smith said, by individuals seeking their own self-interest, individuals seeking to better their life and having the ability to set aside energy, not just having to grow food and consume it, but actually have excess to be able to then use that. And this has allowed for the development of cities and commerce, and trade. And so you find that so many people are involved now in trades and services that were not there before. And cities allow for that, and commerce allows for that. And what is the basis of commerce? Money. This is a time of money. A few hundred years ago, most people never even used money. Maybe a few people, if you're out in the countryside on your farm, barter, you'd use foodstuffs, goods, these sort of things, but people didn't have, certainly not fiat money in terms of cash. This is more a modern invention. Now, it's always been there. You could look back a couple thousand years, people have had gold coins, but not to the degree that you have now. And that's transformed, you could say, how we conduct ourselves in commerce. And what is money really? We had a series of classes a while back on money magnetism. And money is simply condensed energy. It's energy you can't, how are you gonna hold energy? Because money is, you might say, a potential. I can use this money, and even if it's not currency, it's something a credit card or a bank balance, it's a potential that allows me to convert that into something. And so consequently, you have this development of money as a form of energy. Cities were able to develop because of that. At the basis of it all, there's self-interest. And of course, it's unenlightened self-interest, unfortunately, for most people. Most people see money in terms of, again, material wealth, going out and pleasure, happiness, through the senses, in terms of what it can materially do for me. But I like to, and sometimes that is discouraging from a materialist or from a spiritual point of view. But on the other hand, I think this is one thing, that thinking in longer rhythms, and if you see that there's a general direction, just as the individual has to learn that simply pleasing myself through the senses, pleasing myself through accumulation of wealth, me and mine, or me and my little family, we understand spiritually that's very limiting, it's very egoic. And the answer is to expand that to include others into one's reality. So too will society eventually come to see that. And so that gives me hope. It gives me more of a positive view on the direction that society is going. Then, of course, you might say, well, that's going to be a long time before mankind gets to that point. Maybe not in my lifetime. Yes, it's true. But if you look at the world through the lens of an ascending yuga, from self-interest to enlightened self-interest, meaning other people's welfare is also included in my own welfare, you can see that slowly, that's what is developing. And if you look at countries, the way they're organized, governmental systems, that you see sometimes it's discouraging in the short run. But if you have a sense that, well, it's just a phase that people have to go through till ultimately a higher expression, I find it a little bit peace-inducing that I say, okay, just like Swami's view of India, that, well, it has to go through a materialistic phase, but underneath, there's always that spiritual realm. And so it is our job as yogis is to carry on that tradition and infuse the yuga with that consciousness. Yes, there is more to this. And that's an important aspect to keep us going in an upward direction, because the potential in this yuga is for discord. The energy, high energy, coupled with selfishness and limited self-interest, in terms of individual, self-interest in terms of societies. My country über alles, like in the old German phrase, Deutschland über alles, is what motivated World War II. And we don't want to see that again, but the potential is there. So that's a little bit, gives us pause to think. So, but again, coming back, in this age, there's social mobility. You see people will be something energetically. Barriers, as Sri Yukteswar and Master said, will begin to break down. Artificial barriers. These nation states that we find, are very protective of me and mine. Slowly in this age, they will begin to dissolve. Master predicted the United States of the world. It will own United States of Europe, United States of the Americas, United States of Asia, perhaps, of the world itself. People will begin to, those barriers that separate people now will slowly begin to dissolve, because communication, you can't isolate people anymore. People begin to see their natural affinity with people who share the same consciousness with them. I was doing a seminar on Friday night with a group of people in China. And of course, very different culture, different, people can't use their real names online. They use code names because of censorship. Well, that's going to end. It's time people reach. You can't isolate people in the future. these sorts of barriers will begin to fall away. And I find that hope-inducing, and it's a good direction that people will go. But of course, it has to be kept within reason and not allow the negative aspects of Kali Yuga, restlessness and selfishness, which we find ourselves in right now, leading to warfare. And of course, Master predicted there's a high possibility of warfare in this first part of Dwapara Yuga, and that unless we overcome these negative tendencies individually within ourselves and also societally, there will be warfare. So that possibility is always there, which we have to prepare for outwardly, but also inwardly for those sorts of times. But it's not inevitable. And it's up to us individually in a society to make sure it doesn't play itself out in those negative ways. There's, I guess you could say, coming back to that theme of individuality in this age, people are able to make choices according to self-interest. And as time goes by, they'll become, the higher level of awareness, they'll make more informed choices. But think in terms of our ability, our access to information. Look, just within the last 25 years, some people that are younger don't remember a time before the internet. Somebody was yesterday at a discourse was saying, she was a little bit elderly. She said, yes, I sent a letter. She was saying, when I was younger, I sent a letter to Swamiji, those, and she said, those things you used to have to put a stamp on, who sends letters these days, not very often. And now we have the web, and you can have knowledge is at one's hand. At hand, you can know this, you can know that, just about anything. And so you find that this greater expansion of knowledge, and you can find you can go delve into some particular aspect of knowledge way beyond what you could before. There's millions and millions of sites, hobbies, things that you could explore if you want to. We were talking the other day in another seminar also about communities. Master predicted in the future that communities will be one of the things that will develop in Dwapara Yuga. It will be you might say, a societal form. And just as I was saying, as borders begin to break down, not just outer borders, but those things that separate people, and through the greater communication, people can be attracted to other people of like interest. And so people form these groups who are interested in railroads, or they're interested in airplanes, or interested in some enthusiasm they had. In the same way, on a higher level, people can connect with people of similar consciousness. And Sri Yukteswar explained that the natural evolution of mankind's spiritual development is, as we develop, we are attracted to people of like mind, whether they're in this country or another country. And so it is. People who are interested in locomotives, they find other people interested in that, and they form a community of like-minded souls interested in a certain enthusiasm. The same applies to us, people who are interested in seeking God, people are interested in practicing yoga, people interested in higher consciousness. We have the ability now to come together, and we will come together because there's magnetism. Master said that, or used to say, like attracts like. And there's something impelling the spiritual devotee who wants to know truth. They begin to naturally, that desire for the knowledge of truth will attract them to other souls who have that same desire. And together in satsang, the basis of satsang, they will be able to pursue truth even better. And in other words, they'll reinforce one another in their enthusiasm. And that magnetism brings out and enriches and enlivens that natural magnetism within each of us. And so consequently, Master predicted in the age to come, communities will become a natural societal way of life for people. The people will congregate according to their communities. Now, that has a negative side to it, possibly, if you're thinking in terms of self-interest. People who, in Kali Yuga way of thinking, was, well, my community versus your community, and my community versus that community. That's an old way of thinking. But as we develop this idea of coming together, people will then break down the barriers and begin to think in terms of larger and larger communities. Those things which bind us one to another, rather than those things that separate us one from another. But these elements of expansiveness, of inclusiveness, and energy, you can see it will express themselves in many different interesting ways. Think of healing, for example. Health. Look at back over the last couple hundred years, how medicine itself has evolved. And now, of course, it's gone from, unknowing how this body operates to now basically very mechanized in a sense. There's the modern medicine is so advanced beyond what it was before, but still we look at the body in terms of a very refined, complicated, intelligent machine. I think in this age, we're going to see, with its emphasis on energy, we're going to be able to fulfill that other side that Sri Yukteswar mentioned, our ability to manipulate those energies and control those energies, and those energies being outside are also inside. So the ability for us to inwardly work with the energy that's within ourselves for spiritual upliftment, yes, but also simply for practical maintenance of the body. It was predicted, it said that in higher ages, people live longer. This is an ancient tradition. They say in the high ages in the past, people's lives were much longer than they are now. Lifespans declined in Kali Yuga. But now, what do we see? We see lifetimes extending. Now, some people say, well, that's good, maybe for the individual, but society, that's going to put stress on society. But in the long run, we could say, well, yes, it may, but we'll begin to, I don't know exactly what would happen with that, but certainly we would, a healthy long life could be something to allow the individual to spiritually mature and have a great benefit spiritually for a person, assuming that it's a healthy life. But yet, if we gain the ability to improve that health, outward means, but particularly from inward means, we could see that what a change that would have upon society as a whole. I think you'll probably see arts. Now, I don't consider myself particularly artistic in the sense of painting or music or those sorts of things. But what might it have on art? How might art express itself in terms of, I would think it would be much more in terms of flow. You would think certain things that are flowing would, music, for example, is a flow. Those sorts of things would be in tune. Artistic forms of sound, of flowing light rather than static, just on something that's static. How energy dance, you could say, maybe there's artistic forms of dance would evolve. It'd be very interesting. As this Dwapara Yuga begins to advance, you could see there'd be a change toward what would be called a Treta Yuga, the Yuga that follows us. Now, in Kali Yuga, we're dealing with matter and we have to force objects into motion, brute force of it. And so we have to, and then we do that by manpower, brute force. In Dwapara Yuga, we begin to use these other subtle forces to be able to move, move energy in this world. Slowly, as we begin to move into Dwapara Yuga toward Treta Yuga is based upon magnetism. It's attracting. And so you can see this movement from forcing something to attracting it is a development that also happens in our spiritual life. We try to force our consciousness. We try to, the ego I am, you could say, willing myself. The strong will develop in Dwapara Yuga, but to the degree that I am forcing myself egoistically toward enlightenment, or I'm trying to raise this energy and use through the use of my techniques, we haven't yet grasped the higher aspect of how spiritual advancement takes place. Spirituality is developed essentially through magnetism, through drawing life force up the spine and not forcing it. And so sometimes take this into something like Kriya Yoga. People are thinking Kriya Yoga is a technique, it's a pranayama technique. And people think, well, if I put a great deal of force and the greater my will, the greater the flow of energy. And there's a certain forcefulness to it, which can have benefits. It moves that energy. But subtly, as a person becomes a deeper Kriya Yogi, we realize that we have to attract life force up. And Kriya Yoga is based upon this principle of developing magnetism within the spine, developing magnetism by the development of devotion, developing magnetism by awakening the light at the top of the spine. And so then that light, that magnetism of the heart begins to draw those forces toward fulfillment. And so you see, this is a directional flow that's taking place within us individually. We learn that individually, but society as a whole will start to think in terms of magnetism. You could see coming to thinking in terms of some things in terms of our human potential. We gain control over the physical world, and then we learn to work with the physical world. And I guess you could say that people are becoming the natural forces harmonizing ourselves to that flow. So consequently, we can learn to, first we think, and I need to control my mind, I need to control my life force. That's a very Dwapara Yuga way of looking at it. And then we move into harmonizing and magnetism. One of the things I think will probably the intellect and the mind power, these sorts of things will also develop in Dwapara Yuga. They say that we use maybe 10 to 15% of the brain capacity of what's going on in the brain. I think we probably actually use much more than that. We just don't know what it does yet. But nevertheless, neuroscientists say there's so much more potential that we could do, the brain can do, that we've just tapped the surface of it. And I think you're going to find in Dwapara Yuga that the ability for development of psychic powers, to work subtly with these inner energies, this is going to develop too. And you have to hope that it'll be done wisely. So here we are at this beginning of Dwapara Yuga. And I think we come back to our spiritual path. Why did the masters come? And I think thinking in terms of the yugas puts our spiritual path of Kriya Yoga, the path of our gurus, our line of gurus, Babaji, Hirimashai, Sri Yukteswar, and Master, puts them into perspective. They incarnated at this particular time at the beginning of Dwapara Yuga in order to introduce these techniques, introduced to the world a broader understanding of yoga, an ancient practice, but little understood in its broader implications. Their coming was not coincidental. It's, you could say, planned. In the autobiography of a yogi, Master says that Babaji is in charge, you could say, of the spiritual evolution of the planet during this age of Dwapara. And so these great masters have incarnated to introduce these techniques, these applications, and this general consciousness into the world in this age. And so you might say, to sum up, there's a couple of things we will learn during Dwapara Yuga. We talk often about happiness, and I think one of the things we'll learn is that the experience of happiness, this feeling of being happy, is the result of the movement of life force in the body. Now, we talk about this and we know this, but society as itself has not yet come to this understanding that happiness is not based upon things outside of ourselves. Happiness is the result of the movement of life force within the body, and that we have the ability to influence and to use that life force. And this is a general directional movement of society. And you could see we're not there yet. And you could say, Sri Yukteswar said that we really are not in Dwapara Yuga fully until the majority of our soul, and he said it, the majority of the consciousness in a solar system is of that understanding. Their consciousness resonates with what Dwapara Yuga is understanding. And he actually set a very high bar for that. He said, generally, people in this age will come to generally know that this world is not essentially matter, and they will become aware of the inner universe within themselves and learn to be able to uplift that life force, control that life force within the body, to be able to generally be baptized in the holy sound of Om. Now, I look about me and I see how many people are at that state of consciousness now. Not very many, but nevertheless, it gives me hope. I'm going to say maybe it could be brought down an octave and say the general consciousness of people in Dwapara Yuga will be in that Yuga fully, when the sense of awareness that happiness is not outside of ourselves, but happiness is within ourselves. And it's within that movement of life force up from the base of the spine and the senses up toward the brain. Now, that would be a remarkable development. But the second part, and this is also what Sri Yukteswar Master emphasized, that's one qualification of Dwapara Yuga. And the second consciousness will be the experience of our personal happiness will be enhanced through the expansion of one's awareness and sympathies to include others. You could see, and then going back to what I've said, we're not fully, we are technically, cosmologically, by the movement of our solar system in Dwapara Yuga, but our consciousness is still heavily influenced by what's gone in the past. The Kali Yuga is still very much the basis of much of our way of thinking. But slowly, that is going to recede. And Master said, if it does not, it's going to take outward forces such as warfare and disruption to cause us to reject that and to move fully into a more enlightened way of thinking. But maybe we can naturally move into that direction. And when we can learn that happiness is inside of ourselves, and that the enhancement of that happiness and the sustainability of that happiness is based upon the expansion of those awareness that of our sympathies. So from self-interest to enlightened self-interest, when that becomes the general state of consciousness of mankind, humankind in this solar system, then we will be fully into Dwapara Yuga. And of course, then there's even more beyond as we move into the future yugas. But rather than trying to go into that, let's stick with what we have, and let's make this world as best as we possibly can and be an influence on it, because every soul, every individual matters. Matters. If when it stops, when the individual doesn't matter, then we're basically going back into Kali Yuga. That's Kali Yuga way of thinking. Every individual matters. But as Master said, I love a soul more than a crowd, but I love a crowd even more of souls, enlightened souls. And that's the direction of ultimately our responsibility is to take the world, is to the degree that we can do it, one soul at a time, ourselves, and then through expanded self-interest, helping other people as well. And if we can start little pockets of Dwapara Yuga communities, little pockets of Dwapara Yuga sanghas, this beyond our imagination will have an influence on society at large, because the movement of the cosmos itself is in our favor toward an upliftment of consciousness. But we as individuals need to do our part so that we move into that future age willingly, embracing it, rather than world events forcing us into that higher state of consciousness. So that was a little bit of an overview on Dwapara Yuga. When we bring up these words, Dwapara Yuga thinking, Kali Yuga thinking, it's in this context that we're sharing these ideas. Now,